Okay, so this is going to be stages 5 and 6 of genocide. Um, Stage 5, following stage 4, which is dehumanization, is organization. A couple of you had, actually, quite a few of you had questions regarding whether genocide has to be on purpose. I think someone asked if genocide could happen on accident, like if natural disaster occurred. Genocide has to be organized and planned and executed on purpose. If, for instance, an entire race were to be taken out by a natural disaster, that would be extinction. So genocide is always organized, usually by the state, and usually the state uses militias to provide deniability. So they will orchestrate a lot of what's going on, but they won't actually use their forces to carry it out. So they create special army units or militias, train and arm them, and then there are often plans made for the genocidal killings. This is setting up for how the actions are going to play out as things escalate. In the Holocaust, they actually used the military itself because Hitler was able to organize the government in the way that he desired. So just a couple examples of the way that that government is organized. You have the Wehrmacht, which is the armed forces, the Schutzstaffel, which is the SS. That's essentially, they would be like our Marines, a more specialized armed force. The Fuhrer, which was the Prime Chancellor, Hitler. And then another example would be the Einsatzgruppen, which were the mobile death squads. A couple examples of organization, again from the Holocaust. The prisoners that were in camps and prior to some of the later stages, the camps were truly used as prisoner camps. They would designate what type of prisoner it was by a different type of patch. So most of us are familiar with the yellow Star of David, but we have a number of other different colors and shapes. You've got, the majority of the other ones are triangles, actually. The red for the communists or the political prisoners. Green would be anyone who was gonna go to jail anyway, so like murder or anything like that. Foreign forced laborers, that would be kind of captured nationals of countries that they invade, so not Jewish, but still captured by the Nazis. And then the one that's interesting here, because it ties into the idea of forced sterilization, is the Black Triangle. And the Black Triangle were people who were deemed asocial, and that included people like gypsies, which was the second most persecuted group in the Holocaust, alcoholics, the mentally ill, any type of genetic disorder that could be passed on to a later generation was considered a threat to the race, and therefore they were imprisoned. In Cambodia, Pol Pot was essentially the leader of the military or the militia, and he was in direct contact and had help from the Khmer Rouge, which is the regime and the government. And they worked together to kind of restructure the way that Cambodia worked to help aid the furthering of the genocidal ambition. And then the Holodomor was largely organized around Stalin's dekulakization regime, which began in 1930. And the three initial stages basically were put in place so that everything didn't happen at once and people would start to panic. Instead, it would happen in smaller stages where they wouldn't necessarily realize how bad it was getting, how quickly. So first you have the liquidation of the kulak, or the Ukrainian farms, in districts of wholesale collectivism. So they're taking away the mobility rights from Ukrainian farmers who are seen as a threat. And then they start deporting households to Siberia, which is in Russia, with very, very little money, and that's it. And then eventually they started stripping the successful farmers of their land and moving those farmers to work camps, which takes us to the sixth stage, which is polarization. Polarization is kind of, I mean, if you look at the root, it's polar, and anything that is polar is completely opposite. So you have the South Pole and the North Pole, they are polar on opposite ends of the globe. So if you think about it, polarization is taking the two groups and making them as opposite as possible. So this is when the extremist group or the perpetrator group starts creating an you're with us or against us type of community. So they're going to start driving the groups apart through propaganda, laws permitting intermarriage, like those Nuremberg laws. They try to split society into basically you are either for us or against us, like I said, and they're going to do that through fear. So the moderates, the people who have not chosen a side yet, so they're not in the victim group, they're not on the side of the perpetrator, they've kind of been staying under the radar, they're the first group to be targeted because they have the power to stop this progression. And yes, genocide can be stopped. There are intervention strategies at every stage that can stop the further progression and ultimately the mass extermination. But they were the first to be threatened and arrested because that would strike fear into other moderates and hopefully get them to take the side of the Nazis. So Hitler saw individual thought and moderation as a threat to the race. So unless you were fully in to his idea of racial purification and I can't think of the word right now. I'll come back to it. But he would go as far as to take the police force and use that to enforce his policy, and anyone to oppose that would be some of the first victims of the persecution. And we're going to talk about persecution, which is a later stage. And then if they did oppose, but they were not a part of the victim group or the targeted group, they were typically put into a concentration camps kind of as a way to snap them back to their senses and rejoin what was considered the correct side. So just a couple of examples. Like I said, Hitler saw that, oh, this is exactly the same as earlier. I forgot to update it. But in Cambodia, it was common to be shot if you were caught speaking a foreign language. If you were wearing glasses, which I mentioned earlier, they would target intellectuals. And glasses were seen as a sign of intellectualism. And so there would be a lot of fear around anyone who wore glasses or wearing glasses. Basically, you could get shot if you were doing pretty much anything that they believed was out of line. And many people were also relocated to communal prison farms if they were not complying. And then in Armenia, the Turkish government publicly charged the Armenian bakers in the army bakeries of poisoning the Turkish forces via bread. And they were beaten, even though there was evidence that showed that they were innocent. The government refused to back down because if they did, it would indicate that they may make false accusations in other circumstances, which would lose their power. So, in an attempt to basically get them to incite a massacre, they don't rescind the charge. And they continue with the eventual execution of these bakers.